Hey guys, tonight we step into a city made entirely of paper wood, and very bad luck if you happen to be holding a candle too close to a window. You're standing in Edo, the beating heart of Tokugawa, Japan, where fire lurks around every corner. You probably won't survive this, honestly. One tipped lantern, one spark carried by the wind, and suddenly half the city turns into a bonfire. It's basically one giant, accidental barbecue waiting to happen. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And of course, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step cautiously through the narrow streets of Edo sometime around the mid-18th century. Every building around you is wood timber beams, paper walls, bamboo screens. The shops hum with life tea houses, rice merchants, kimono makers. Paper lanterns swing gently overhead, casting soft orange glows as the evening settles. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Edo, modern-day Tokyo, was one of the largest cities in the world during the Tokugawa period, with over 1 million residents packed tightly together by the 18th century. And nearly all of it was terrifyingly flammable. You duck under the eaves as wind stirs dust along the street. The houses are so tightly packed that a fire in one could leap to the next in seconds. Chimneys puff smoke, tiny cooking fires glow inside homes, and oil lamps flicker behind paper doors, every single one a potential disaster. Here's your quirky tidbit. Edo residents even had a grim nickname for these citywide infernos: Edo no Hana, or the flowers of Edo. Yes, you heard that right. Fires were so common they were treated almost like seasonal blossoms, horrifying yet familiar. Historians still argue whether Edo's rapid urbanization outpaced its fire safety strategies. Some suggest that as population density soared, even the best firefighting efforts couldn't keep up. Others argue that the Tokugawa authorities implemented remarkably sophisticated systems for their time, considering the risks. You pause beside a merchant closing his shop for the night. He pours water onto the threshold, a daily ritual to keep embers at bay. Beside him sits a covered wooden bucket, always ready. Every home has one. Everyone knows the rules. When fire strikes you, don't run, you join the bucket line. The smell of charred wood occasionally lingers in the air, even when nothing's burning. It's a constant reminder, fire isn't an occasional hazard here, it's a part of life. But what happens when the alarm is raised, when flames leap and panic ripples across the neighborhood? That's where the real story begins, with the men of Edo's legendary Haikeishi fire brigades racing into action. And that's exactly where you're heading next. You don't have to wait long. The quiet crackle of a spark grows into the sharp shout of Kajida fire. The call echoes through the narrow streets like a sudden storm, and instantly Edo bursts into coordinated chaos. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Fires broke out in Edo with alarming regularity. The city's dense wooden architecture, combined with open flames for cooking, heating, and lighting, made urban fires a near constant threat throughout the Tokugawa period. You spin around as neighbors throw open their doors, pulling out wooden buckets, wet towels, and heavy quilts. Storefront shutters slam shut as merchants try to protect their precious stock. The wind whistles through the alleyways, fanning the growing flames as embers leap from roof to roof like tiny assassins. Here's your quirky tidbit. Edo's wind patterns were notorious accomplices in these disasters. Locals even had a phrase for the deadly seasonal gusts: yamakaze, dark winds. These gusts could carry embers across entire districts, turning a small fire into a citywide catastrophe in minutes. Historians still argue whether the very design of Edo doomed it to these recurring infernos. Some blame short-sighted urban planning that prioritized rapid rebuilding over safer layouts. Others argue that even with the technology available, Edo's fire risk was simply unavoidable, given its climate materials and dense population. You press back against the flow of residents, forming neat human chains, the bucket brigades. Like muscle memory, the lines snap into place. Children, women, merchants, and laborers passing water hand to hand in perfect rhythm. The buckets slap into open palms, splash into flames, and return in a steady heartbeat of hope against rising heat. Every home contributes. Every hand helps. The fire isn't just one family's problem, it belongs to the entire block. Communities drill for this, practicing their lines like soldiers preparing for battle. In Edo, survival means cooperation. You watch as buckets are refilled from nearby wells, ponds, or cisterns installed specifically for firefighting. Teams shout and coordinate, adjusting positions as the fire spreads unpredictably. Leaders bark orders while others beat at small flare-ups with soaked quilts or earth-filled wooden scoops. Here's where you see Edo's resilience shine. Despite the terror, there's no chaos here, only fast, brutal efficiency. Every man, woman, and child knows exactly what to do. They've done it before. They'll do it again, one elder mutters as he passes a bucket down the line. The gods test us often, but we know how to answer. His voice is calm, practiced, as if fighting fire is simply part of the city's daily rhythm. Here's your fringe debate. Some scholars suggest Edo's frequent fires helped shape its uniquely adaptable culture, training its people to rebuild, reorganize, and refine their communities with each disaster. Others argue the cycle was wasteful, setting back development and forcing repeated losses on ordinary citizens. The flames continue to rise as the bucket brigade fights on. But a new sound pierces the night, the clanging of bells and the pounding of wooden clappers. The Hikeshi have arrived, and next you'll meet these professional firemen, Edo's rough, fearless, and sometimes gloriously reckless firefighting elite. The rhythmic clack of wooden clappers grows louder, slicing through the smoky air like sharp blades. You turn to see them arrive, not villagers, not merchants, but Edo's firefighting elite, the Hikeshi. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1718, the Tokugawa shogunate established official firefighting brigades known as the Hikeshi to battle Edo's relentless fires. Divided into units assigned to different city wards, they became a crucial part of Edo's urban life. You watch them march in with surprising calm, almost like a parade. Wide-legged stances, thick quilted jackets gleaming with soaked water, and distinctive crests emblazoned boldly on their backs. They carry long hooked poles axes, and their iconic matoi standards held high above their heads. Here's your quirky tidbit. The Hikeshi were not just firefighters, they were celebrities. Young boys idolized them. Kabuki actors copied their fashion. Edo's residents gossiped about their bravery, their brawls, and sometimes their scandalous personal lives. Imagine firefighters crossed with rock stars and local tough guys. Historians still argue whether the Hikeshi were genuinely effective firefighters or more symbolic morale boosters. Some point to their fearless building demolitions as effective firebreak tactics, while others note how their fierce rivalries occasionally made fires worse. You watch as the Hikeshi assess the blaze. Their task isn't to extinguish the fire directly, that's often impossible, but to prevent its spread. They move quickly, identifying which neighboring structures must be torn down to create fire breaks before the inferno leaps any farther. Here's where the real danger lies: controlled destruction. With their long hooks, the Hikeshi pull down entire roofs and walls, collapsing buildings to starve the fire of new fuel. It's brutal, but necessary, like cutting off a gangrenous limb to save the patient. One young firefighter leaps onto a roof, balancing with astonishing ease despite the smoke and embers swirling around him. His comrades cheer him on as he wedges a hooked pole beneath a roof beam and wrenches it free in one powerful heave. The building groans, shifts, then collapses into itself. Here's where you notice the insane combination of precision and chaos that defines Edo's firefighting. They aren't just fighting flames. They're navigating narrow alleys, unstable rooftops, collapsing timber, and roaring crowds, all while racing against time. A nearby merchant clutches his wares, anxiously watching his neighbor's house fall under the Haikeshi's tools. "Better my shop than the whole district," he mutters grimly. It's a bitter calculation every Edo resident learns to make. Here's your fringe debate. Some urban historians argue that the Haikeshi's demolitions may have saved entire neighborhoods more often than their bucket work ever could. Others suggest that property destruction sometimes spiraled out of control, forcing costly rebuilds that benefited wealthy landlords more than commoners. The flames slowly shrink their greedy tongues, starved of wood and air. As dawn approaches, the Haikeshi rest against collapsed beams, sipping tea and swapping stories as smoke still curls around them. They know they'll likely be called again before long, but their work isn't done yet, because every fire fought also fuels fierce rivalries between different Haikeshi teams. And next, you'll step into the strange, sometimes violent world of Edo's firefighting turf wars. The sun barely crests the rooftops when you notice it. Not every Haikeshi team is celebrating the same victory. Tension lingers between rival brigades, their crests gleaming on damp jackets, as they eye each other like samurai, sizing up opponents on a dueling ground. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Edo's Haikeshi brigades were divided into numerous groups, officially organized into different wards, but often fiercely competitive. Rivalries between units could turn dangerous, sometimes erupting into outright brawls right in the middle of firefighting efforts. You stand at the edge of two camps now, one crew resting after the long night's battle, another striding in with chests puffed, accusing the first of having arrived late or having stolen credit for saving the block. The tension crackles almost as tangibly as last night's embers. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Haikeshi brawls were so notorious that they spawned their own subculture of folk songs, kabuki plays, and gossip. Crowds sometimes gathered not just for fires, but to watch rival brigades argue and even fight for honor after the flames were out. Historians still argue whether these rivalries were encouraged by the shogunate as a way to foster aggressive firefighting enthusiasm, or whether they reflected the fractious nature of Edo's highly stratified society, where every group fought to maintain face and status. A veteran firefighter squints at the newcomers and mutters under his breath. They're only here for the glory, not the flames. His comrades nod, half in agreement, half savoring the drama about to unfold. Here's where you realize how much reputation mattered. Fighting fires wasn't just about public safety, it was about honor status and earning the admiration of Edo's citizens. To save a block meant glory. To fail meant shame. And these were men who didn't tolerate shame lightly. Arguments escalate into chest-puffing contests. Insults fly. One man throws off his soaked jacket, daring another to settle the dispute physically. The air hums with the energy of barely restrained chaos until an elder officer steps between them, raising both hands. "Tomorrow brings more fire," he says simply. "Save your strength." Here's your fringe debate. Some scholars argue that these rivalries actually spurred the Haikeshi to greater bravery, creating a culture of fierce dedication. Others criticize the system for prioritizing honor games over efficient firefighting, occasionally escalating the danger when cooperation was needed most. You watch as the crews finally part, but the tension doesn't fully dissolve. Tomorrow, or even later today, they'll likely meet again, racing for the next blaze, the next chance to claim victory or disgrace. And while the city's official brigades fought their turf wars, another layer of firefighting was quietly thriving, one bankrolled not by the government, but by Edo's rising merchant class. And that's where you're headed next, into the world of private firefighting wealth and guild protection. The smoke has barely faded when you find yourself drawn toward another part of Edo, one that smells less of charred timber and more of lacquered wood silk, and the quiet hum of coin counting. Here, the merchant class runs its own firefighting game. Here's your mainstream historical fact. beyond the official Haikeishi brigades, funded by the shogunate Edo's wealthy merchant guilds, organized private fire brigades to protect their businesses, warehouses, and fortunes from the ever-present threat of flames. You enter a district lined with two-story machiya townhouses, elegant merchant homes with thick wooden shutters and clay-tiled roofs, built as much for fire resistance as for status display. Inside, vast storerooms brim with rice silk sake barrels and precious paper, all painfully flammable. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some of Edo's wealthiest merchant guilds maintain their own firefighting teams, known as jobikeishi, often better equipped and better paid than the government's own Haikeishi. These were elite specialists hired to protect specific businesses and neighborhoods like a private insurance policy in human form. Historians still argue whether the rise of these private brigades reflected cracks in the Tokugawa system or simply demonstrated the merchants' growing influence. Some suggest the shogunate quietly tolerated private brigades because they reduced its financial burden. Others argue these groups symbolized the merchants' quiet challenge to the rigid class hierarchy. You watch as one such private crew drills in a courtyard, practicing the lightning-fast formation of bucket lines. Their uniforms gleam with embroidered crests, signaling not government authority, but guild allegiance. The wealth behind these men is obvious, and their loyalty lies with their sponsors, not the shogunate. Here's where you spot the delicate balance of Edo society. Merchants were officially beneath samurai in status, but wielded immense economic power. By funding firefighting, they gained influence, secured favor, and protected the very assets that fed the city's prosperity. A guild leader nods approvingly from a lacquered balcony as his men practice. "Water keeps rice safe," he murmurs half to himself. The rice warehouses, after all, aren't just merchandise. They're currency, collateral, and lifeblood. Here's your fringe debate. Some scholars argue that Edo's merchant-funded firefighting was a form of proto-capitalist self-governance, an early hint of private enterprise stepping in where state functions strained. Others suggest it was simply self-preservation, disguised as civic duty. You stroll past stacks of wooden buckets stamped with the merchant guild's insignia, not just tools, but symbols of wealth, power, and responsibility. In Edo even, a bucket carried political weight. As you turn away from the merchant compounds, you hear new voices rising from the side streets. Not firefighters this time, but ordinary citizens, women and children who also played vital roles whenever the alarm bells rang. And next, you'll see how entire neighborhoods, not just men with axes, turned into well-drilled firefighting machines when Edo's flames threatened to consume them all. The narrow alleys buzz with life as you walk deeper into Edo's residential neighborhoods. Here, the polished uniforms and private guilds fade away. Instead, you see ordinary people, wives, children, elders, preparing their own version of battle against fire. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Firefighting in Edo was not limited to the professional Haikeishi. Neighborhoods organized their own communal response teams, with every resident knowing their role in the event of a blaze. You pass a family standing beside a wooden cart stacked with dampened quilts, water buckets, sandbags, and long bamboo poles tipped with hooked blades. Everyone has a job. Men break apart vulnerable wooden fences, women soak quilts to drape over roofs, children form mini bucket lines near doorways. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some neighborhoods practiced fire drills regularly, treating them like community festivals. Children were taught firefighting songs to help them remember their duties, turning terrifying emergencies into oddly rehearsed performances. Pass the bucket fast and steady. Water flies, keep the fire ready, one boy sings under his breath. Historians still argue whether these community efforts were genuinely effective or more symbolic acts of mutual support. Some suggest the sheer speed and cooperation of neighbors made a real difference. Others believe that against massive fires, these actions offered more comfort than actual control. You watch an elderly woman sprinkle water across her roof's thatched edge, a daily precaution during the dry season. Nearby young girls carry small buckets ready to chase stray embers before they can land and ignite new blazes. Here's where you realize the genius of Edo's communal life. Everyone understood that fires didn't respect class, wealth, or age. Your neighbor's house burning today could mean your own burning tomorrow. Solidarity wasn't optional. It was survival. Even the construction of homes reflected fire awareness. Roof tiles were designed to be easily removed, allowing entire buildings to be dismantled rapidly to create fire breaks. Simplicity wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was practical engineering. You hear a neighborhood leader call out assignments, his voice calm but urgent. Women to the eastern roofs. Children stay by the well, men prepare the tools. No panic, just well-rehearsed motion like gears turning smoothly under pressure. Here's your fringe debate. Some social historians argue that Edo's fires helped foster a uniquely resilient cooperative urban culture, one where rigid class hierarchies softened at the neighborhood level. Others caution that many lower-class districts bore the brunt of repeated fires, disproportionately suffering losses without compensation. As you move past more homes, you notice household shrines adorned with tiny charms, amulets against fire gods, offerings of rice or sake, left to protect the fragile timber walls. Even divine protection was recruited into this constant battle against flames. A small boy hands you a wet cloth with serious eyes. Hold it over your mouth if the smoke comes. The training begins young here. Everyone knows the rules, and as night falls again, the most crucial guardians of Edo's fire defense step forward, not firefighters, but watchers. Men with wooden clappers, lanterns, and sharp ears who patrol the sleeping city hour after hour. And next, you'll follow their quiet, steady march through Edo's moonlit streets. The city settles into night now, but Edo never truly sleeps. Somewhere beyond the distant rooftops, another cooking flame flickers, another lantern swings in a draft. And so the night watchmen emerge guardians who fight fire not with water, but with vigilance. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Edo employed teams of night watchmen known as Hai-no-ban, whose sole duty was to patrol neighborhoods after dark, watching for early signs of fire and raising the alarm before disaster could spread. You hear them before you see them, the steady con-con-con of wooden clappers breaking the hush of midnight. They walk in pairs, each carrying a lantern and a small wooden hammer they rhythmically strike against wooden blocks, announcing their rounds. Here's your quirky tidbit. The Hai-no-ban sometimes sang short phrases as they walked, not only to keep themselves awake, but also to remind residents to check their hearths, beware of fire. Guard your lamps, sleep safely. Think of it as Edo's ancient version of a late-night PSA. Historians still argue whether the night watch was primarily an effective firefighting measure or more about maintaining public order and shogunate control. Some suggest that the presence of patrols genuinely reduced fire risk. Others point out that the watchman's real job was as much about curbing theft and unrest as it was about spotting smoke. You follow one pair as they weave through the narrow streets, pausing at each intersection to scan rooftops and sniff the cool air for the telltale scent of smoke. Their lanterns cast long shadows across rice paper windows, briefly illuminating worried faces peeking out from behind shoji screens. Here's where you appreciate Edo's layered defenses. While bucket brigades, haikshi, and neighborhood teams fought fires directly. The first battle was always fought with early detection. A flame spotted early could be contained before the bucket chains ever needed to form. The watchmen exchange nods as they check a merchant's shop with its cooking embers safely banked for the night. All clear, for now, but everyone knows how quickly that could change. One watchman grins as you pass. The city breathes while we watch. His voice is soft, but the pride is clear. They aren't simply guards. They're caretakers of the sleeping city. Here's your fringe debate. Some urban historians suggest that Edo's combination of professional night watch neighborhood vigilance and rapid response brigades represents one of the earliest organized urban fire prevention systems globally. Others argue that no system could fully offset the enormous risks built into Edo's flammable design. You glance upward at the mass of wooden beams and dry thatch looming above. One ember, one careless spark, one overturned lantern, and the high-no ban would become the first to sound the terrible warning. Kaji-da. For now, the city slumbers peacefully. But beyond the patrolled wards, fire policy wasn't just local, it was political. And next, you'll step behind the shogunate's curtain to see how fire prevention became part of Tokugawa control over Edo's delicate social order. The narrow alleys fade behind you as you step into the polished corridors of Edo's ruling class, the Tokugawa shogunate. Here, fire wasn't just an urban hazard. It was a political threat, a lever of control, and a reflection of the very structure that held Edo together. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Tokugawa regime viewed firefighting not only as public safety, but as a tool to enforce its rigid social hierarchy and centralized rule. Controlling fires meant controlling people. You stand before a group of senior officials calmly discussing the latest blaze. Their concern isn't simply about burnt buildings, it's about tax revenue, population stability, and preserving the fragile order of a city balanced on careful rank and obedience. Here's your quirky tidbit. The shogunate issued strict building codes known as haiban, regulating everything from the size of cooking hearths to the allowed width of city streets, all in the name of fire prevention, but also to keep tight control over how neighborhoods developed and expanded. Historians still argue whether these fire regulations were genuinely proactive safety measures or cleverly disguised methods of population management. Some believe the shogunate sought to protect its citizens. Others argue that fire laws were part of the regime's larger system of social surveillance and containment. You glance at maps unfurled on the council table. Edo's city plan itself was designed in part with fire in mind: wide firebreak avenues, separating merchant districts from samurai quarters, open moats doubling as water reservoirs, and designated evacuation routes intended to funnel people towards safety while keeping disruptive crowds manageable. Here's where you see the Tokugawa's genius and paranoia intertwined. A well-managed fire response wasn't simply about survival. It was about preserving the illusion of unshakable order. Even in disaster, people were expected to behave according to their role. When fires struck commoner districts, the shogunate often allowed the wealthy merchant guilds to finance rebuilding efforts, maintaining infrastructure, while avoiding any shift in political power. Control of reconstruction was another layer of centralized authority disguised as civic cooperation. You overhear an official murmur. The merchants rebuild, the people obey, and the city endures. It's a tidy system provided the fires don't grow too frequent or too devastating. Here's your fringe debate. Some scholars suggest that Edo's regular fires became a sort of controlled burn, preventing unrest by allowing periodic resets that never threatened the political core. Others argue that frequent destruction frayed social stability and disproportionately harmed the lower classes. You glance toward the government's elite firefighting brigades, the Jobikeshi directly overseen by the shogunate to protect critical zones, like the castle and upper-class residences. Their presence is another reminder, while commoners fought for their homes, the ruling class had its own private safeguards. And yet, despite all these layered controls, fires still raged. And every time the smoke cleared, Edo's residents rebuilt faster, stronger, and often with slightly better fireproofing shaped by painful experience. As you leave the council chambers, you sense how fragile this balance always was. Political stability rested on both human discipline and sheer luck. Because fires didn't care about rank, only about wood, wind, and timing. But how effective was this entire system? That debate rages even now. And next, you'll step into the scholarly tug-of-war over whether Edo's fire defenses were brilliant, disastrous, or simply the best bad option available. The smoky embers may have cooled, but the arguments still burn. You now step into the quiet halls of modern historians, each carefully weighing Edo's firefighting legacy, sometimes applauding it, sometimes shaking their heads at its contradictions. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Edo's firefighting system was one of the most elaborate urban fire responses of its era. Yet the city still suffered hundreds of major fires during the Tokugawa period, many earning names and infamy across generations. You hear one scholar declare confidently, "For its time, Edo's firefighting was remarkably advanced. They adapted to the challenges of flammable materials, dense populations, and limited technology." His voice carries admiration for the community drill's Haikishi organization and layered neighborhood preparedness. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some fires grew so famous, they earned poetic names. The Great Maireki Fire of 1657, for example, was known as the Furisode Fire, allegedly started by a cursed kimono. Yes, a haunted garment burned at a temple, and releasing flames that consumed much of the city. Historians still argue whether Edo's system prevented more disaster than it allowed. Some argue the collaborative blend of public, private, and neighborhood defense likely saved thousands of lives. Others argue that systemic weaknesses, competitive Haikishi rivalries, political control, and relentless urban growth kept the system forever reactive rather than preventative. You picture rows of wooden townhouses rebuilt again and again on the same fragile footprint. The cycle of burn, rebuild, burn played out across centuries like a dangerous urban ritual the city couldn't escape. Here's where you feel the great contradiction. Edo was masterful at managing fire's aftermath, but struggled to fully prevent fire's inevitability. Every improvement helped wider streets, stricter codes, better coordination, but nothing fully conquered the constant threat. Another scholar leans in more critical. They built a city designed to burn and then became very good at cleaning up afterward. His tone is sharp, but not without truth. Here's your fringe debate. Some urban theorists propose that Edo offers lessons in adaptive resilience, accepting periodic destruction as a manageable cost, rather than fighting endlessly for impossible total safety. Others reject this, calling it an excuse for avoidable human suffering. You walk past archival drawings, Haikishi charging into smoky streets, neighborhood bucket lines stretching across courtyards, clapper-armed watchmen under moonlit skies. All heroic yet helpless before the combined forces of wind, dry wood, and bad luck. And yet, despite its flaws, Edo's fire management system wasn't forgotten. In fact, its strange blend of community cooperation, specialized brigades, and layered prevention would echo far into Japan's modern firefighting system. And next, you'll step into that very transition, how Edo's burning lessons became the foundation for the sleek, high-tech firefighting forces protecting Japan today. The smoky streets of Edo blur and shift, transforming beneath your feet. Timber beams give way to steel frames. Dirt lanes harden into paved boulevards. But the echoes of the Haikishi still pulse beneath Japan's modern cities. You're standing now in Tokyo, the grandchild of Edo, where firefighting has become sleek, fast, and professional. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Japan's modern firefighting forces trace many of their roots directly back to the systems developed in Edo. Even today's fire brigades carry ceremonial traditions, uniforms, and values inherited from their Haikishi ancestors. You watch a modern Japanese fire crew assemble gleaming red trucks, high-pressure hoses, thermal gear, a far cry from wooden buckets and quilted jackets. But their disciplined precision and community-minded approach feels strangely familiar. The DNA of the old bucket brigades still lives here. Here's your quirky tidbit. Every year, modern Tokyo firefighters honor their Haikishi heritage with elaborate New Year's demonstrations, performing high ladder balancing acts called Dezome Shiki, echoing the rooftop acrobatics once performed by Edo firemen during drills and festivals. Historians still argue whether modern Japan clings too tightly to these ceremonial traditions. Some say these cultural displays strengthen civic pride and public trust. Others caution that romanticizing Hikaishi culture risks oversimplifying the brutal hardships of Edo's fires. You watch as the firefighters launch their drills ladders rising swiftly, hoses snapping to life, teams moving in near-silent synchronization. It's no longer just about containing small neighborhood blazes. Tokyo's crews face earthquakes, skyscraper infernos, chemical hazards, threats unthinkable to their Edo ancestors. Here's where you appreciate the remarkable adaptability of Japan's firefighting culture. The same community-driven, highly organized response that once carried buckets now coordinates helicopters, robotic equipment, and emergency rescue teams capable of mobilizing across entire prefectures. Nearby, a fire captain offers a simple nod to his crew as they finish the drill. "Quick hands, clear heads," he says softly, a phrase that could have easily belonged to an Edo Hikaishi leader centuries earlier. Here's your fringe debate. Some sociologists argue that Japan's strong emphasis on collective responsibility, visible even today in its natural disaster responses, owes much to Edo's centuries of communal fire defense culture. Others suggest this cohesion stems more from broader cultural traditions than from firefighting alone. You pass a glass display case inside the fire station's small museum. Inside rests a preserved Edo-era matoi, its wooden standard polished and pristine. Nearby hang faded Hikaishi coats, their heavy stitching still water-darkened from ancient bucket lines. The modern stands beside the ancient, both speaking the same quiet language of duty. And as you step back outside into Tokyo's sprawling skyline, you realize the final legacy of Edo's fires isn't found in its old wooden beams or narrow lanes. It's found in the muscle memory of cooperation, the unspoken understanding that when danger sparks, everyone moves together. But before we leave these embers entirely, you'll take one last walk through Edo to reflect on how its fiery struggles still influence how cities everywhere think about disaster resilience and community survival today. You walk once more through the imagined streets of Edo, this time not to witness flames or chaos, but to quietly absorb what this city forever flirting with fire has taught the world. Its wooden beams may be long gone, but its lessons still glow beneath modern city lights. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Edo's constant battle with fire profoundly shaped Japanese approaches to urban design, emergency planning, and disaster management, echoes of which are visible even today in Japan's meticulous disaster response culture. You stop at a recreated Edo neighborhood in a museum exhibit. Model houses show how streets were laid out, fire breaks widened, and regulations tightened after each major fire. Edo rebuilt itself repeatedly, not in blind repetition, but in hard-earned adaptation. Here's your quirky tidbit. After particularly devastating fires, the Tokugawa shogunate temporarily banned roof tiles and luxurious multi-story buildings, forcing simple, fast rebuild structures that minimized future losses, a fire-conscious version of minimalist urbanism. Historians still argue whether Edo's cycle of destruction and rebuilding stunted its urban evolution or made it unusually resilient. Some suggest these constant resets limited architectural advancement. Others argue that Edo became one of the most adaptive, self-correcting cities of its era. You study diagrams showing early forms of zoning merchant districts set apart from samurai estates. Wide avenues doubled as both fire breaks and military parade routes. Waterways redirected to serve as reservoirs. Disaster planning and political control were often two sides of the same coin. Here's where you feel the heartbeat of Edo's hard-learned pragmatism. Perfection was never the goal. Manageability was. When you can't eliminate risk, you prepare to face it together and rebuild as many times as necessary. A modern urban planner nearby explains Tokyo's earthquake readiness owes much to these Edo practices. We build expecting failure not as defeat, but as part of resilience. His words are calm, almost comforting in their realism. Here's your fringe debate. Some emergency theorists view Edo as an early prototype of modern disaster-tolerant cities, embracing modular architecture, distributed response teams, and decentralized citizen drills. Others caution that without modern technologies, Edo's resilience was always dangerously precarious. You glance at a comparison chart: Edo fires, Tokyo's Great Kanto earthquake, modern earthquake drills, tsunami escape routes. All variations of the same ancient story: humans facing forces beyond control, learning not to prevent disaster entirely, but to endure it better each time. Even the cultural memory of Heikeishi lives on not just in ceremonies, but in how Japanese citizens instinctively form lines, follow silent cues, and aid strangers during emergencies. Centuries of bucket brigades trained an entire society to act collectively when crisis strikes. As you leave the exhibit, you turn back one last time, imagining the clack of wooden clappers, the shouts of kaijida, the blur of water buckets, and the bright, fluttering Matoi standards rising against black smoke. And next, you'll gather these threads together to see not just how Edo fought fire, but how its bucket brigades still shape how cities anywhere survive when flames return. You walk through the quiet cityscape one last time, but now you're looking beyond Edo, beyond Tokyo. You're seeing every city that's ever faced disaster and noticing how Edo's old bucket lines whisper through them all. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Urban disaster planning across the world, from fire drills to emergency zoning shares, principles remarkably similar to Edo's methods: early detection, rapid response, controlled sacrifice, and most of all, community mobilization. You pass modern skyscrapers with sprinkler systems and fireproof stairwells. You see open parks designed not only for leisure, but as safe gathering spaces in case of earthquake, fire, or flood. These are the heirs of Edo's firebreak avenues and neighborhood drills. Here's your quirky tidbit. In parts of Tokyo, certain parks still double as designated emergency supply depots, containing food, water, and temporary shelter equipment, modern versions of Edo's water cisterns, and community bucket stores. Historians still argue whether Edo's resilience came from its government's control or its citizens' adaptability. Some give credit to the Tokugawa for organizing overlapping systems. Others emphasize the neighborhood's self-organized networks and traditions of mutual aid. You study diagrams comparing Edo's bucket brigades to modern incident command structures. Both rely on coordinated roles: detection teams, suppression crews, rescue units, and community volunteers scaled up with technology, but still deeply human at their core. Here's where you sense the timeless truth. Fire, flood, earthquake, all disasters strip away social pretense. What remains is people. Neighbors passing buckets, whether literal or metaphorical. A modern firefighter explains, in a crisis, training isn't enough. Trust matters. Rehearsal matters. Knowing you've stood in that line before, even if it was only practice that saves lives. His words echo those shouted in Edo's smoky streets centuries ago. Here's your fringe debate. Some disaster theorists argue that modern cities are becoming too reliant on technology, forgetting the power of communal readiness Edo embodied. Others believe today's sensors, drones, and AI-enhanced responses are the natural evolution of those ancient bucket lines. You walk past a modern fire station where sleek trucks idle ready for the next call. On the wall inside an old Heikeishi Matoi standard hangs in quiet honor a reminder that beneath the technology still beats the same ancient rhythm: vigilance, coordination, sacrifice, survival. Even cities far from Japan unknowingly borrow Edo's wisdom. Fire lanes in Los Angeles, seismic zoning in San Francisco, flood defense drills in Amsterdam. Each in its way repeats the old lessons plan for failure: train together, recover fast. As the city lights flicker into the evening, you sense Edo's enduring gift, not the impossible promise to prevent all disaster, but the steady courage to face it again and again and again. But before we fade entirely into modern streets, you'll return briefly to Edo's final and most enduring legacy, not just how they fought fire, but how their resilience still shapes the human spirit. The streets blur softly now as you drift one last time into Edo. Not as a place, but as a mindset. Because while the wooden houses have fallen and the bucket brigades have faded, the city's truest legacy was never its architecture. It was its people's stubborn refusal to surrender to disaster. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Edo's citizens lived with fire not as an occasional emergency, but as an expected part of urban life. Their resilience wasn't a reaction, it was a way of being woven into daily routines, seasonal rituals, and even their sense of identity. You walk past merchants' closing shop at sundown. Before they rest, they douse doorways with water fold-up fire quilts and double-check lanterns. These aren't extraordinary safety measures. They're habits practiced daily, like breathing. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Edo families made small charms from folded paper or bits of cedar praying for protection from fire gods, like Homusubi no Kami. Shrines offered fire prevention amulets, and entire festivals prayed for calm winds and gentle flames. Historians still argue whether this constant fire awareness bred a unique cultural resilience or simply normalized the acceptance of recurring loss. Some say it forged Edo's famously adaptable cooperative society. Others suggest it hardened people to routine tragedy, accepting destruction as inevitable. You watch neighbors gather after another fire is finally beaten down. The air still smells of smoke, but already the rebuilding begins. Children carry buckets of nails, carpenters sharpen blades, brickmakers stack fresh clay. No speeches, no self-pity, only swift, quiet labor. Here's where Edo's deeper genius emerges. They never aimed for invincibility. They aimed for recoverability. Buildings could burn. Lives must go on. If one home fell, 10 neighbors helped lift it again. A gray-bearded craftsman nearby mutters an old saying, "The fire tests the wood." The people test each other. His hands move steadily, even as fresh embers float in the cooling air. Here's your fringe debate. Some resilience researchers argue that Edo reflects an early model of anti-fragility systems designed not to resist crisis entirely, but to absorb shocks, adapt, and emerge stronger. Others caution that too much acceptance can breed complacency in the face of preventable risk. You watch as children skip across half-built frames, already laughing their parents hammering quietly below. Tomorrow, another wall will rise. By month's end, the street will bustle again, as if nothing burned. Even today, in Japan's modern cities and its earthquake drills, that same rhythm endures. Prepare together, face danger without panic, rebuild without delay. The flames may change, but the spirit remains. And as you breathe in one last quiet moment under Edo's smoky stars, you prepare for the final reflection on how this ancient city's fight against fire still whispers lessons far beyond its own time, shaping how all of us confront life's flames. The embers of Edo dim to a quiet glow as you drift into the broader view, not just of Japan, but of humanity itself. Because whether in wooden Edo brick London or concrete San Francisco, fire has always been our oldest, most familiar enemy. And teacher, here's your mainstream historical fact. Across civilizations, urban fires have forced cities to rethink not only their architecture, but their social fabric. Like Edo, many ancient cities learned the hard way that resilience depends as much on people as on structures. You step now through a collage of moments, the Great Fire of London. Tearing through timber homes. Chicago's Inferno of 1871, swallowing entire neighborhoods. San Francisco's double blow in 1906 earthquake and fire reducing streets to ash. Here's your quirky tidbit. After the Great Chicago Fire, some citizens jokingly called themselves members of the Bucket Brigade Club, sharing stories eerily similar to Edo's residents rushing into lines passing water and rebuilding by morning. Historians still argue whether repeated urban fires delayed modern urbanization or paradoxically accelerated it. Some credit these disasters with forcing better building codes, street planning, and civic organization. Others note that rebuilding often pushed out poorer residents, deepening inequality in freshly designed cities. You watch as modern skyscrapers rise with sprinkler systems, flame-retardant materials, and automated alarms. And yet, you also see fire drills, community preparedness classes, neighborhood watch programs, distant cousins of Edo's night watchmen, and bucket lines. Here's where Edo's ancient lesson becomes universal. Even with all our technology, prevention isn't enough. What matters most in the crucial first minutes are people who know how to respond, who've practiced together, who trust one another to move quickly and calmly. A modern urban planner explains smart cities don't eliminate disaster, they design for survival. Edo knew that. You sense his quiet admiration, not for Edo's fragility, but for its ability to adapt again and again. Here's your fringe debate. Some futurists argue that modern cities should embrace Edo-like modular designs, flexible, easily repairable neighborhoods that can absorb disasters without full collapse. Others worry that such designs may sacrifice long-term durability for short-term recoverability. You glance across a digital map showing evacuation routes in Tokyo, Amsterdam's rising sea walls, California's wildfire break zones. In each design choice, you hear Edo's old voice. Leave space. Prepare the people. Know your neighbors. Practice the drills. Trust the line. And as you step softly back toward Edo's smoky streets one final time, you feel the pulse beneath every plank and bucket, the stubborn, timeless human refusal to be undone by fire, not through brute strength, but through practiced hands and collective hearts. And now gently we'll close this journey and let Edo's embers cool into the soft quiet of sleep. The streets fall silent one last time as Edo fades fully into the folds of history. You walk slowly now, feeling the weight of centuries pressing softly against your shoulders, not as a burden, but as a steady, familiar hand. Here's your mainstream historical fact. While much of Edo's physical city has vanished, the mental framework it built of resilience, community coordination, and disaster readiness remains deeply embedded not only in Japan, but in cities worldwide. The smoke no longer stings your eyes, but you can still sense it curling through narrow alleys, drifting above rooftops, clinging to dampened quilts that once saved entire neighborhoods. You can almost hear the shouted rhythms of bucket lines and the sharp clack of the Hino band's wooden clappers slicing the night. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some neighborhoods of modern Tokyo, old wooden buckets are still displayed ceremonially during festivals, silent reminders of what once protected entire families, entire districts, with nothing but water teamwork and determination. Historians still argue whether Edo's citizens were victims of a city doomed by its design, or heroes of a society that mastered its own impermanence. Some describe their world as a fire trap, others as a marvel of human adaptation in the face of unstoppable danger. You pause beside a small stone marker in a quiet Tokyo park, one of the few surviving monuments to Edo's great fires. The inscription is simple names, lost streets, rebuilt lives carried forward. It's not a monument to loss. It's a monument to continuance. Here's where the final truth settles gently on you. The brilliance of Edo was never in preventing disaster. It was in refusing to be broken by it. The bucket brigades may have long since dispersed, but their spirit-fast hands, calm hearts, practiced cooperation lives in every orderly evacuation, every emergency drill, every neighbor who steps up when flames or floods return. The wind softens now as your steps grow slower. The bucket lines dissolve into gentle whispers. The distant clack of wooden clappers fades into the quiet hum of a peaceful sleeping city. And as you breathe one last time beneath Edo's starlit sky, you know the fire always comes. But so do the people, the lines, the buckets, the hands, and always the rebuilding. The city rests now wrapped in a soft, smoky memory. The clatter of buckets, the shouts of neighbors, the crackle of flames, they've all grown distant like echoes carried off by the cool night breeze. You stand still, breathing gently, as Edo's streets dissolve beneath your feet into the quiet comfort of sleep. The embers that once threatened to consume everything now glow softly warm but harmless, like distant stars scattered across a velvet sky. The lessons of resilience hum faintly in the background. Steady hands practice drills, neighbors side by side, each breath of wind carrying centuries of quiet courage. The weight of destruction never fully disappeared, but neither did the will to rise again. Houses rebuilt, streets reformed, families gathered stronger with every loss endured. The city never needed to be unbreakable. It simply needed to endure, and it did, with grace, patience, and unwavering hands, ready to pass the next bucket. Your breath slows, your body eases, and the last sounds fade, not with alarm, but with peace. The wooden clappers fall silent. The night watch completes its final round. The city sleeps, and now so do you. Sweet dreams.